The earliest days referenced in the surviving accounts describe a landscape suspended between decay and muted expectancy, as if the air itself understood the unspoken rules governing the plantation grounds. Dawn along Bayou Lafourche did not rise so much as seep, slow, colorless, and without conviction, through the tangle of moss-draped cypress limbs. A pale fog clung low over the sugar fields, gathering along the furrows like a second, colder harvest. It muted the world into a palette of grays and bruised greens, swallowing distances, shortening the plantation to a tight, breathing organism whose boundaries were defined less by fences than by fear and long memory. Within this closed ecosystem stood the McErrell House, a two-storied structure of warped clapboard, blistered whitewash, and windows that seemed perpetually half-shuttered, as if guarding its occupants from the same world they claimed to rule. Floorboards sank in the center under the weight of decades. Doors swelled from humidity until they refused to close, and the long central hallway, stretching from the front parlor to the kitchen at the rear, carried every footstep like a whispered confession. The house was the plantation's conscious mind, and the quarters, scattered along a packed earth road behind the cane processing shed, its suppressed memory. Connecting them was a silence cultivated deliberately, maintained ritualistically, and broken only through sanctioned commands or the occasional sound of punishment. It was into this world that Elise Carter moved with a precision so quiet it appeared unnatural, even to those accustomed to silence. Assigned to the house since adolescence, she carried herself with an exactness that bordered on ceremonial. Her footsteps along the hallway were weightless yet measured. Her posture betrayed neither fatigue nor defiance, and her hands, narrow, steady, capable, seemed always prepared for the next task before it was spoken. There were whispers that Elise anticipated orders not because she was obedient, but because she refused to be caught off balance. Others said she possessed a kind of listening sharper than sight, trained through survival rather than service. What unsettled people most, however, was her face, always composed, a calmness too controlled to be natural, the expression of someone who had learned that silence could wound more deeply than words. Among the enslaved workers, her reputation had grown into something half feared, half respected. They watched how the family spoke to her, never affectionately, yet with a wariness absent from their interactions with others. They noted how the overseer, Jonah Riggs, avoided touching her even when issuing commands, as if proximity to Elise might ignite a fuse he did not understand. Whispered accounts suggested she had once intervened during a punishment or thwarted some cruelty through a gesture so subtle that no one could agree on what she had actually done. But the overseer's subsequent caution became its own kind of evidence. In the quarters at night, women spoke her name with lowered voices, the way one references a storm known to change direction without warning. The plantation family, Charles McErrell, his wife Lorinda, and his younger sister Evelyn, maintained the outward routines of plantation life, though each bore the marks of a household grown brittle. Charles, accustomed to obedience as an extension of his identity, carried his authority like a tool too frequently used and poorly maintained. His voice had the coarse rasp of someone accustomed to shouting, though recent months had softened his commands into an almost distracted tone. Lorinda, pale and severe, governed domestic operations with an anxious rigidity, demanding order in objects because she could not achieve it in her thoughts. Evelyn, who lived on the second floor and rarely descended before midday, was known for her nerves. She read constantly, avoided conflict, and kept her distance from both Elise and the overseer. Together, they shaped a hierarchy less stable than it appeared. In the earliest entries of a surviving ledger attributed to Lorinda, one finds not accusations but observations. Linens misplaced, windows left unlatched, spoons unaccountably tarnished overnight. These notations read like the concerns of a housewife maintaining order, but in context they were harbingers. The McArroll household had developed an unease that no one acknowledged directly. Small things began to move. Routines were interrupted. The rhythm of work shifted by increments too slight to attribute to chance. Someone began checking locks twice. Someone else remarked that the hall felt colder than usual in the evening. Nothing in isolation suggested danger, yet the cumulative effect was erosion. Elise, for her part, revealed nothing. She moved through the house with the same unervingly calm rhythm, lighting the morning lamps, folding linens in the upstairs parlor, sweeping the long hallway in a straight, uninterrupted line. Her silence had weight. Even her breathing seemed trained not to attract notice. But her eyes, dark, steady, taking in everything, betrayed an intelligence sharper than anyone openly acknowledged. Workers in the quarters said that Elise had been this way since childhood, long before she was assigned to the main house. They said she remembered everything. Every order, every punishment, every cry that went unanswered. They said nothing truly escaped Elise's notice, though she rarely acted on what she knew. It was during one of the early mornings, before the sun had broken the horizon, while the fog still clung to the veranda steps, that a small but consequential incident occurred. Elise was tasked with retrieving a ledger from the upper hallway cabinet, a simple errand she performed weekly. Yet this time, when she opened the cabinet door, a small leather journal slipped forward, falling against her wrist before landing soundlessly on the floor. No initials marked its cover, but the handwriting visible along the page edge indicated it belonged to Evelyn. The pages inside were densely written, some with ink smudged from what appeared to be hurried or emotional passages. Elise did not open the journal. She did not need to. The existence of a private record, hidden rather than stored, carried implications. She placed it back exactly as she had found it, adjusting its alignment by millimeters. Yet someone had entered the hallway moments earlier and noticed her posture. Jonah Riggs, barefoot on the creaking floorboards after a night spent overseeing a delivery at the sugar shed. His gaze lingered longer than necessary. Elise, returning the ledger to her arm, seemed not to acknowledge him. It was an interaction without words, without movement, yet charged with something unmistakable. Riggs would mention later, in the overseer's log, that Elise's handling of items had grown curious. No specifics, no accusations, merely a note that something, however small, had registered. By midday, a rumor traveled through the quarters with the efficiency of a well-practiced system. Someone in the house was expected to be punished. No name was attached to the rumor, no reason given. But the whisper spread quickly enough to create tension in the workspace behind the cane mill. People sharpened their focus on their tasks, kept their voices low, and watched the main house for signs. An opened upstairs window, a door left ajar, the posture of Charles McArroll as he crossed the veranda. Fear moved ahead of certainty, filling the gaps that facts had not yet reached. That afternoon, Lorinda McArroll conducted her inspection of the kitchen, an exercise she performed with increasing severity in recent months. She pointed out a smudge on the copper kettle, a crack in a porcelain teacup, a misaligned stack of plates. Elise took each criticism with the same unbroken composure, her hands steady, her expression blank, her voice, when required, soft and without inflection. The cook, Mariah, stole glances at Elise, searching for a clue, perhaps even a signal, but Elise remained as unreadable as ever. It was this lack of visible reaction that unsettled the household more than any actual mistake. Near dusk, as the day's light thinned to a rust-colored haze, a second, more consequential moment unfolded. While preparing the evening parlor lamps, Elise entered the front hallway and paused briefly, not long enough to attract suspicion, but long enough to register an overheard conversation. Charles and Jonah were speaking near the study door, their voices low but strained. Elise could not see their faces, only the edge of Jonah's shoulder and the shadow of Charles's hand resting heavily on the mantel. Not saying it was deliberate, Jonah muttered, but there's something in her movements, something she's not saying. Charles's reply was terse. Silence is not guilt. But guilt hides in silence more than in speech, Jonah countered. You know that. There was a pause. Elise continued walking, her steps soft yet unwavering. She did not slow again, but she had heard enough to understand two things. First, that her actions, however precise, were now being studied. Second, that suspicion had already begun to colonize the house in ways she could neither control nor ignore. By nightfall, the air inside the McErrell home felt heavier than usual, thick with the heat that accumulated in wooden structures during late summer. The floors creaked more loudly. The shutters rattled despite the absence of wind. The workers in the quarters prepared for sleep with an unease that did not dissipate even after the lamps were blown out. Somewhere near the far end of the plantation road, a dog barked repeatedly, then stopped abruptly. And Elise, completing her final tasks of the evening, moved through the narrowing corridors with the same careful, measured steps. Yet something in her stillness had changed. Her silence no longer felt merely disciplined. It felt purposeful, weighted, as if it carried a history not yet spoken and a decision not yet revealed. In the days following the incidents of the first week, the plantation settled into a rhythm that felt familiar on the surface, yet subtly distorted beneath it, like a melody played a half-step off-key. The fog lifted earlier, the humid air thickened into something almost metallic, and the workers rose each dawn with a shared intuition that the household had entered a season of quiet instability. Nothing overt had happened. No official punishment, no announcement, no open suspicion voiced, but the environment itself felt altered. People walked more carefully, listened more intently, and spoke in shorter phrases, ensuring no spare word remained available for misinterpretation. The first of the small accidents occurred on the third morning after the hallway incident. Evelyn McErrell, descending the main staircase with a book in hand, slipped on the fifth step from the bottom. The fall was not severe enough to cause lasting injury, but it sent her sprawling across the polished wood with a sharp cry that summoned both the cook and the nearest field hand assigned to morning tasks. When the family gathered around her, murmuring concern, Elise appeared at the top of the stairs, calm, steady, holding the small rug she had retrieved for dusting. She said nothing, simply observed the scene with a neutrality that made Jonah Riggs stiffen. Later, Charles asked if the stair had been recently cleaned. Lorinda insisted it had not. Someone claimed they had seen a wet streak earlier. Someone else contradicted it. The confusion lasted longer than the fall itself, and while no blame was assigned, the event settled into the household like the first tremor before a quake. Small, survivable, but impossible to forget. 2 days later, a second incident followed. A pot of stew prepared under Lorinda's supervision spoiled inexplicably before the evening meal. The broth curdled, the vegetables turned a sickly gray, and the odor was so sharp and sour that Mariah refused to serve it. Lorinda accused her of negligence. Mariah, trembling, insisted she had followed the instructions exactly. Elise, who had been responsible only for chopping the herbs, stood a few feet away without expression. When questioned, she answered evenly, without hesitation, citing every step she had taken. Yet when Lorinda ordered both women out of the kitchen until she could determine the source of the problem, the look she gave Elise was marked by something new, unease, not anger. These incidents, minor as they were, began to accumulate weight. Keys were found in the wrong drawer. A ledger disappeared for half a day. The wrong tea leaves were placed in the afternoon pot. Every mishap was small enough to be dismissed as human error, yet suspicious enough to stir speculation. The enslaved workers began to watch each other with sharper eyes. Mistakes carried consequences, and suspicion was contagious. They whispered at dusk, sharing their own interpretations of the accidents. Some believed Elise was involved, either deliberately or through some knowledge she refused to share. Others defended her, claiming the house itself had turned restless, or that Lorinda's increasing nervousness had infected the environment. But no one spoke these theories aloud within earshot of the family. Silence, once a habit, became a shield. Fear, however, always finds an exit. One night, as the workers prepared for sleep, a quiet conversation took place behind the farthest cabin. Two men and a woman exchanging hushed worries. One of the men confessed he had seen Elise lingering near the kitchen door the morning the stew spoiled, though he could not say she had touched anything improper. The woman countered that Elise often moved silently through the house. Seeing her anywhere proved nothing. The second man said nothing at all, his gaze fixed on the dim outline of the McErrell house, as if expecting it to shift or speak. "Something's coming," he finally whispered. "It ain't her doing, but she knows when it's coming." The dynamic among the enslaved shifted quickly. Some avoided Elise. Others gravitated toward her, hoping proximity offered protection. A few nurtured jealousy, wondering why she, of all people, was spared the harsher tasks assigned to others. This moral fracturing played out quietly, in sideways glances and altered routines. Even the children sensed the change, worrying their fingers into their sleeves whenever Elise passed by. Meanwhile, the overseer's watching eyes grew sharper. Jonah Riggs developed a habit of entering rooms unexpectedly, as if hoping to catch someone in the middle of an act of sabotage. He questioned workers about their whereabouts at odd hours, inspected tools twice, and lingered on the veranda after sunset, staring out toward the cane fields with a posture that carried the stiffness of poorly contained suspicion. He never confronted Elise directly. Her calmness seemed to unsettle him more than any wrongdoing would have, but he followed her movements with an intensity that did not go unnoticed. It was around this time that the first attempt to warn the family occurred. A young boy, Nathaniel, no more than 12, was sent to the main house with fresh laundry. Instead of placing the folded linens where instructed, he asked to speak with Lorinda privately. Lorinda, startled by the request, initially refused, but Nathaniel's trembling convinced her otherwise. Behind the half-closed pantry door, he whispered something hurried and breathless. Lorinda's face shifted from irritation to confusion to indignation. She dismissed him sharply. The boy returned to the quarters pale and shaking. No one knew exactly what he had said, but it was widely believed he had tried to warn Lorinda about the accidents, or about Elise. By nightfall, Nathaniel had been reassigned to field labor for overstepping, a punishment severe for one so young. His silence afterward was total. This event deepened the divide among the enslaved workers. Some viewed Nathaniel's punishment as a sign that truth was dangerous. Others believed he had lied out of fear or envy, and that the punishment was justified. The arguments remained brief. No one dared raise their voices, but the emotional distance between individuals widened. Elise, ever silent, neither comforted nor condemned anyone. Her refusal to acknowledge the tensions only heightened them. A week after Nathaniel's reassignment, another disturbance marked the household. Mariah, the cook, failed to appear for morning duties. A search revealed nothing, no signs of flight, no personal items missing, no explanation. When Jonah reported her absence to Charles, the conversation lasted barely a minute. Charles ordered a replacement to be trained immediately. Jonah suggested quietly that Mariah might have been frightened off by recent events. Charles dismissed the idea without interest. No formal search was conducted. The quarters reacted with a mixture of grief and dread. Some believed Mariah had fled, others suspected a darker fate. Elise's reaction was unreadable. She continued with her tasks as if nothing had happened, though one worker later claimed she saw Elise pause at the doorway to the kitchen, her hand lingering on the frame a heartbeat longer than usual. In the midst of these mounting tensions, Elise made a choice, subtle, but unmistakable to anyone who observed her closely. One morning, while cleaning the parlor, she rearranged the items on Charles's writing desk. It was not unusual for her to tidy the surface, but this time she shifted the placement of a single object, a brass letter opener Charles had inherited from his father. For years it had rested on the right side of the blotter, angled toward the inkwell. Elise moved it to the left, aligning it parallel to the ledger instead. A small change, almost invisible, yet Charles noticed immediately upon entering the room. He frowned, held the opener in his hand for several seconds, then placed it back in its original position. This act, small, precise, and intentional, did not cause immediate suspicion, but it marked a shift. Elise had altered something personal, something symbolic of authority. It was not defiance in any overt sense. Rather, it was a quiet misdirection, a subtle assertion of presence in a space where she was expected to remain invisible. It was an action that could be interpreted in a dozen ways, but none of them harmless. As days passed, more accidents occurred. A lantern cracked from heat, though it had shown no flaw before. A shirt belonging to Charles was found torn along the seam, though Elise insisted she had not touched it. A freshly scrubbed floor seemed intentionally slick in one corner, though no soap residue was visible. Each incident was explainable: heat, wear, human error. Yet the accumulation formed a pattern too consistent to ignore. The moral landscape within the quarters grew treacherous. People began making quiet bargains with themselves, to speak or remain silent, to protect or distance themselves, to hope the danger passed or align with whoever might be causing it. Whispers about justice mingled with fears of retribution. Revenge, someone murmured one night, was sometimes just another word for self-preservation. But no one said this loudly. No one dared. Elise remained at the center of these unspoken debates. Her silence was no longer merely a personal trait. It had become a force that shaped the behavior of those around her. She was watched constantly, though rarely addressed. People studied her footsteps, her posture, the angle of her gaze. Some sought reassurance in her composure. Others felt threatened by it. Jonah's scrutiny intensified. Lorinda's suspicion grew brittle. Evelyn withdrew further into her room. The tension tightened like a rope, invisible yet increasingly constricting. Every gesture, every misplaced object, every misaligned rug, every poorly timed noise took on meaning. And through it all, the plantation continued its daily routines, outwardly unchanged, inwardly edging closer to a reckoning. By the final week of this period, the atmosphere inside the McErroll house had thickened to the point where breathing felt like an effort. Conversations were shorter, movements slower. The family sensed the shift but could not articulate it. The workers felt it more acutely, as if the ground beneath their feet had begun to tilt. And Elise, moving with that same steady precision, now carried something in her silence, something sharpened, deliberate, and irreversible. Whether it was protection, vengeance, or necessity, no one yet knew. But the future violence that would define the McErroll household had already begun its quiet descent. The weeks that followed brought with them a heat so dense that even the cypress groves around the Lafourche bent under its weight, their branches drooping like tired limbs. Within the plantation household, however, the temperature rose from a different source, a spreading tension that clung to the walls with the persistence of mildew. The rhythms of daily life continued outwardly unchanged, yet every movement seemed halved, every gesture tentative, as though each inhabitant expected some unseen trap to snap shut underfoot. Elise Carter performed her tasks with the same immaculate precision as before, and yet the character of that precision shifted. It was no longer merely the discipline of survival. It had acquired a quality of intent, as if her silence had grown narrower, sharper, and more directed. What had once been interpreted as dutiful emptiness slowly revealed itself as a vessel containing something volatile, a history too long suppressed, a will too long denied the dignity of expression. Rumors that had first circulated quietly among the quarters now infiltrated the main house through the uneasy murmuring of the domestic staff. Mrs. Beaumont began to clutch her shawls in daylight, claiming to feel drafts where none existed. Her husband, the master of the estate, walked with a stiffness that betrayed his growing mistrust of those closest to him, often pausing beside the doorways to listen for movement before entering a room. The overseer, Mr. Harrow, became the unspoken fulcrum upon which the family's fear balanced. Though no one addressed it openly, the man's presence took on a certain menace beyond his already violent authority. He prowled the perimeter of the house like a sentry charged with intercepting invisible threats, his boots grinding gravel into a rhythm of suspicion. Among the enslaved, alliances formed in whispers, though no one dared acknowledge them aloud. Kitchen workers exchanged coded glances during meal preparations. Laundering girls lingered near stairwells to overhear conversations, and field hands returned at dusk with hints of information wrapped inside harmless complaints. Elise herself became a point of gravitational pull within this web, though she neither encouraged nor discouraged such quiet attention. When she moved through the quarters on sanctioned errands, eyes followed her not out of admiration or fear merely, but out of a collective uncertainty. Did she possess knowledge that could shift the balance of suffering? Or was she becoming something singular, beyond the reach of communal judgment? The overseer's suspicions hardened into a formal regime of surveillance. He began keeping written logs of movements inside the house, crude entries in a thick, sweat-stained ledger where he recorded which worker entered which room, the time they emerged, and any deviation he perceived. This document circulated only between himself and Mr. Beaumont, though a fragmentary page torn from the ledger would later be discovered beneath the south stairwell, bearing Elise's name marked with an ink blot large enough to suggest a moment of hesitation. Whether this hesitation belonged to Harrow or to the pen's failing integrity remained unclear, yet its presence became a quiet symbol of shifting power. Elise Carter was now more than an obedient servant. She was a figure whose actions required chronicling. Her emotional interior, which had been perceptible only in fleeting shadows, grew increasingly legible to those who paid attention. On several occasions, another housemaid, Ruthie, noted that Elise's hands trembled ever so slightly when she folded linens in the upper hall, though her face remained perfectly still. Once, after the overseer roughly reprimanded a young boy for tracking dust into the pantry, Elise was seen standing in the doorway, her gaze fixed upon Harrow's back with a focus so intense that Ruthie felt compelled to pull her away by the wrist. Elise did not resist, but something in the quiet, slow blink she offered afterward suggested an internal resolve strengthening rather than softening. The first major visible consequence occurred on a suffocatingly humid evening near the end of July. A member of the Beaumont family, young Miss Clara, collapsed near the veranda after drinking a cup of cooled tea prepared in the kitchen that afternoon. No one knew whether the cause was illness or something less benign, but the event became the turning point that snapped the household fully into paranoia. The tea had held a faintly bitter aftertaste, according to Clara's mother, though the kitchen staff insisted the leaves had come from the same tin used daily. An apothecary summoned from Thibodeau could find no clear explanation, yet he advised the family to examine their domestic routines with care. This phrase, though innocently intended, became the spark that ignited a system-wide tightening of control. Workers were questioned repeatedly, sleep was disrupted by unexpected inspections, and meals were tasted first by the overseer before reaching the family table. The owner's authority began to fray under the weight of his suspicions. He shouted more frequently, pacing through the corridors with a restless energy that suggested he was fighting an enemy he could not name. Several arguments erupted between him and his wife, carried through thin walls and overheard by nearly everyone in the household. Their disagreements were not about blame, but about fear. The fear that their own cruelty had bred consequences, or perhaps that some force within their home had ceased to recognize their power. Elise, though present during many of these moments, neither recoiled nor inserted herself. Her silence, once passive, had acquired a new charge. It seemed to thrum beneath the surface of her composure like a distant drumbeat signaling an approach. Then came the action, quiet, deliberate, and unmistakably hers, that signaled the point of no return. One rainy evening, while the overseer inspected the storerooms, he discovered that a set of small brass keys, used to secure the medicine cabinet and several locked drawers in the master's study, had been moved from their usual hook and placed neatly upon a crate near the back wall. They were arranged in a perfect line, as if to draw attention to their displacement. No worker admitted touching them. No one had reason to. But Harrow remembered seeing Elise pass through that corridor earlier in the day, carrying folded linens for the upper rooms. The placement of the keys was neither a mistake nor a provocation. It was a message, though its intended recipient remained uncertain. When Elise was questioned, she simply met the overseer's stare with a steady, unblinking calm that unsettled him so thoroughly he ended the interrogation prematurely. From that moment, the plantation seemed caught in a suspended state, a breath held too long. Elise had acted, not violently but intentionally, signaling her willingness to step into moral territory that could not be undone. Her choice, subtle though it appeared, altered the trajectory of every relationship on the grounds. Some workers looked upon her with a mixture of reverence and dread, sensing that she had embraced a path whose consequences might envelop them all. Others distanced themselves, fearful that proximity to her might draw suspicion. The Beaumont family, unable to prove wrongdoing yet unable to dismiss their growing fear, tightened their internal ranks even as their authority wavered. The air in those weeks grew thick with the anticipation of catastrophe, something not yet visible but undeniably underway. Letters exchanged between neighboring planters referenced the Beaumont household in cryptic language, and travelers passing by the property noted an unusual quiet around its main structures, as though the building itself had begun listening. Elise continued her duties, her steps measured, her hands steady, her silence undisturbed, but something in her presence now radiated a controlled intensity. She appeared neither triumphant nor desperate, but resolved, as though she had accepted that the only path forward lay through a storm she had long avoided. What began as rumor now edged into reality. What had once been survival hardened into purpose. And all who lived or labored on the plantation felt, in some deep and wordless way, that the balance of power had shifted, and that Elise Carter, once merely a silent figure in the household shadows, was now the quiet architect of whatever fate awaited them. The documented hours that follow are consistently described in surviving depositions as the most disorderly and terror-filled ever observed on the Carter plantation, though none of the testimonies agree on what precisely happened first. Some recall a strange quiet before dawn, the kind that settles over the land in the split moment before birds begin their morning calls. Others mention a frantic clattering of pots in the kitchen, as if someone, or several people, were searching urgently for something that had gone missing. But nearly all the statements converge on one certainty. The plantation house woke in a state of imminent dread, as though the night itself had delivered something irreversible and final. The first death was discovered at sunrise. Thomas McCullen, the eldest of the plantation owner's sons, was found collapsed on the floor beside his writing desk, his head resting slightly to the right, as though he had attempted to lift himself upward and failed. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned chair, no broken lamp, no visible bruising save for a faint discoloration around his lips, which the surviving overseer later insisted had appeared, like a bluish stain, spreading at the corners. The window shutters remained closed, trapping the warm, stale air of the night inside the small room. On the surface of the desk was a ledger left open, a line of ink interrupted mid-sentence, the quill fallen onto the floor. It was the cook, May Ruth, who first screamed, though in her later testimony she claimed she had uttered no sound at all, that the noise had been a thing that just came out of the room itself. Others, awakened by the scream, flooded into the corridor. The plantation owner, pale and trembling, his daughter Rebecca, clutching the stair rail, and the overseer, Brant, whose first instinct was to demand who had touched the body before he inspected it. In that moment of panic, fear seemed to move through the family like a poison in its own right. Fast, invisible, and unstoppable. When Brant ordered everyone back from the doorway, he did so with such force that even the master obeyed him. Then, kneeling beside the corpse, he pressed 2 fingers to the cold skin beneath the jaw and announced with a voice flat and expressionless, "He's been dead for hours." What followed was not grief, but pandemonium. Rebecca collapsed into sobs. May Ruth fled down the hall. The master shouted for someone to fetch water, though no one knew for whom it was meant. Within minutes, the news had reached the enslaved quarters, carried first in whispers, then in rapid steps across the courtyard. Some workers stood frozen outside their cabins, unsure if the death would bring collective punishment. Others clutched their children, as though the night had come to the doorstep in broad daylight. A few exchanged glances suggesting understanding, not of the cause, but of the inevitability that something catastrophic had finally broken open. And in the midst of all this, as the statements consistently note with unsettling precision, Elise Carter walked calmly across the yard, carrying a folded pile of washed linens, her posture straight, her face unreadable, her steps slow enough to be deliberate but quick enough to fulfill her assigned task. If anyone suspected her in that moment, they did not voice it. If anyone feared her, they hid it well. By mid-morning, the plantation family had sealed themselves inside the main house, drawing curtains, barring doors, locking windows even in rooms that had never known a lock. Brant, consumed by a growing paranoia, established what he grandly referred to as temporary rules of containment, a phrase repeated in 3 later depositions by enslaved workers forced to abide by them. Under these sudden rules, no one was permitted to walk alone, to approach the house, or to leave their designated work areas. Meals were to be delivered to the family only by individuals personally chosen by Brant, and all water sources were to be inspected before use. The atmosphere darkened beyond simple fear. The family refused to touch certain foods, refused to drink from certain pitchers, refused even to breathe near anything that had not been set before them by the overseer himself. The plantation owner's hands trembled visibly. His daughter paced the hallways with a sort of mechanical agitation. The workers, watching from afar, recognized the signs of a household collapsing under its own dread. Around noon, 2 workers, Isaac and Ruth Ann, were summoned to bring water from the kitchen to the main house. On their return, Isaac would give a statement that became central to later accounts. He insisted that the master's daughter, Rebecca, whispered to him that something had been wrong with her brother for days, that Thomas had complained of headaches, of strange tastes on his tongue, of feeling faint at night. Isaac did not reply, for Brant stood just behind him, listening. But he remembered the expression in Rebecca's eyes, a mixture of fear and desperation, the look of someone seeking an explanation even she was not brave enough to articulate. It was then, according to Isaac's account, that he saw Elise standing at the far end of the hall, not moving, not speaking, simply watching. And Rebecca, noticing her gaze, fell silent. The second death occurred less than a day later. If the first had been quiet, almost clinical in its stillness, the second was violent, panicked, and unmistakably heard throughout the house. It began with a high, piercing cry, Rebecca's voice, according to most witnesses, followed by the thunderous echo of something heavy falling to the wooden floor. Then came a series of frantic footsteps, shouts, and the unmistakable sound of a struggle. Furniture scraping, objects shattering, cloth tearing. Several enslaved workers rushed toward the house, only to be driven back by Brant, who appeared in the doorway with a blood-stained sleeve and wild, furious eyes, yelling, "No one enters." Many later recalled the smell that seeped through the open windows, a smell they described as a mixture of sweat and spilled oil, with a sharp metallic note that made some gag. Inside, the plantation family's servants would later reconstruct fragments of what happened. Rebecca, already on edge, had become convinced that someone was trying to kill them, that the water had been tampered with, that the food was cursed, that Thomas's death had been part of a plan. Her father attempted to calm her. Brant attempted to restrain her. But panic, once ignited, spread like fire through the room. Rebecca knocked over a lamp, then stumbled backward, cutting her palm on a broken piece of glass. According to one surviving statement, she cried out that Elise had been watching her through the doorway, that she had seen her standing there without moving, without speaking, breathing so quietly it was impossible to tell if she breathed at all. In the final moments before her collapse, Rebecca ran toward the staircase, perhaps intending to flee the house entirely. She made it only 2 steps before her legs buckled beneath her. Her father fell beside her, screaming her name, while Brant, realizing her lips had turned the same faint blue as Thomas's, pressed his hand against her chest as though to feel for a heartbeat. She died before he could finish the attempt. The house erupted, not figuratively, physically. Brant overturned a table. The master shouted orders no one could understand. Servants screamed. Workers outside saw shadows thrashing behind the curtains. Several testified that a gunshot echoed from inside, though later records list no bullet wound on the body, suggesting the gun was fired either in panic or as a warning. And amid all the chaos, one figure moved with chilling clarity of purpose, Elise. When Brant stormed outside, demanding the immediate rounding up of every enslaved worker, Elise was the first he tried to seize. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin, but she did not flinch. She stood as though the violence passing through the house had not touched her at all. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm, not defiant, not frightened, but composed in a way that made Brant recoil slightly. According to Isaac's statement, she said only, "The house was sick long before today." Brant struck her across the face. And this act, this single moment of violence, became the turning point that transformed panic into full collapse. Several workers stepped forward instinctively, as though to pull Elise away or shield her. Brant, seeing their movement as defiance, reached for the gun still tucked into his belt. The master, stumbling out after him, shouted for him to stop, but Brant, hysterical and consumed by his own unraveling authority, pointed the weapon first at Elise, then at Isaac, then at the small crowd gathering behind them. He accused Elise of poisoning the family. He accused Isaac of helping her. He accused the entire workforce of conspiring against the house. The master attempted to regain control, insisting they needed clarity, that they needed to understand what had happened to his children, but his voice carried no authority anymore. The overseer's fear had eclipsed every other voice in the yard. And then, according to multiple accounts, the gun misfired. The sound was described as a sharp, metallic crack rather than a full shot. Brant yelped, dropping the weapon, clutching his burned hand. The gun hit the ground, sliding toward Elise's feet. The crowd gasped. The master staggered backward. The moment froze. Elise looked down at the gun, then at Brant, then at the master, and she did nothing. That stillness, her refusal to pick it up, to run, to scream, would later be interpreted in countless ways, as innocence, as calculation, as defiance, as judgment. But in the moment itself, it created a vacuum of expectation so intense that every person watching felt the air tighten around their lungs. Brant, furious and humiliated, lunged for her again. And this time, Elise stepped backward, just one step, but enough for Isaac and two others to move between them. The master shouted for Brant to stop. Workers began shouting as well. The noise swelled into something unmanageable, a wave of voices all competing to be heard. Then came the breaking point. The master, exhausted, terrified, and half-mad with grief, pointed at Elise and cried, "She's been the serpent in this house from the beginning." The accusation shattered what remained of order. Brant charged. Isaac grabbed him. Others rushed forward. Someone knocked over a lantern. The dry earth near the house caught flame. Screams rose from every direction. Through all of it, Elise did not move for several seconds. She stood in perfect stillness, watching chaos unfold as though it were a foregone conclusion, as though the violence sweeping across the yard had been written somewhere long ago, waiting only for this day to be read aloud. When she finally acted, it was not to defend herself, but to pull two younger workers out of the path of the spreading fire. She moved them back sharply, then gestured toward the well. Her actions suggested survival, not vengeance, protection, not assault. But the testimonies conflict here, some insisting she seemed guided by something colder, something detached from panic or fear. Brant tried once more to reach her, but Isaac and two others held him down until the master collapsed from exhaustion, sobbing on the steps of the house as the fire crept closer to the porch. Only when the gun was kicked safely aside, and the overseer pinned to the dirt, and the flames brought under control with water, did the yard quiet. And in that silence, with the bodies of Thomas and Rebecca still inside the house, with smoke rising in thin gray ribbons toward the bayou air, Elise finally spoke again. Her words, recorded differently in various accounts, are most consistently rendered as, "Now everything that was hidden stands in the open." The fatal events of those days ended with two members of the plantation family dead, the overseer subdued, half the household in ruins, and Elise Carter standing at the center of a moral landscape no one could fully interpret. Was she a catalyst or a witness? A protector or a destroyer? A woman seeking justice, or one shaped irreversibly by a lifetime of brutality? The testimonies never agree. The truth was buried in the chaos. But the consequences, once set in motion, could not be undone. The hours and days that followed the fatal events of that summer etched themselves into the fabric of the Bayou Lafourche plantation in ways that would outlast both the immediate witnesses and the physical structures of the estate. Smoke from the overturned lanterns lingered in the corners of the house, mingling with the lingering odors of sweat, burnt wood, and the faint metallic tang left by the overseer's panicked movements. The remaining family members, though alive, bore the marks of trauma more deeply than any wound visible on their skin. Their hands shook as they touched the furniture. Their voices trembled when issuing orders, and each glance toward the quarters was colored by suspicion, as though they might find Elise herself lurking behind every shadowed doorway. No immediate arrests occurred. There was no legal framework on the plantation to address a situation of this nature. The nearest magistrate, situated in Thibodaux, was contacted by one of the McErrell family's acquaintances, but by the time word reached him, the surviving evidence was scattered, inconsistent, and contradictory. Testimonies varied wildly depending on the observer, the time of day, and the emotional state of the speaker. Some insisted that Elise had acted with malevolence, deliberately poisoning Thomas and indirectly causing Rebecca's death. Others described her as a figure of restraint and intervention, someone who had prevented a larger catastrophe by guiding workers away from harm, shielding children, and refusing to escalate the chaos herself. The truth remained elusive, and it would remain so for decades. The enslaved community, too, bore the psychic weight of those hours. Nights grew longer, not in terms of darkness, but in terms of vigilance. Whispers circulated of an unseen force, sometimes Elise herself, sometimes the judgment of the house, that would punish any who stepped out of line. Children were kept closer to the quarters. Fieldwork shifted subtly so that no worker had to traverse the yard alone, and many refused to speak of the incidents except in the vaguest of terms. Fear was now codified in behavior. Silence became survival. Even those who had been closest to Elise, those who had watched her for months, could not reconcile the calmness with the devastation, nor could they say whether her actions were justice, vengeance, or something darker. Yet Elise herself vanished from the immediate historical record. Witnesses report seeing her leave the house at dawn following the deaths, carrying only her cleaning supplies, her posture unhurried and her gaze fixed on the far horizon. No one pursued her. No one attempted to capture her in force. Some speculate that she fled into the bayou, hiding among its labyrinthine waterways until she reached freedom. Others suggest she was quietly taken by sympathizers within the enslaved community and moved along the network of clandestine routes that led toward New Orleans and beyond. A few records hint at a later sighting. Elise walking silently along the levee, her presence unremarkable except for the intensity of her eyes. But these accounts are unverified, and some historians dismiss them as legend. Meanwhile, the McArrell family attempted to restore order. Brant, the overseer, was relieved of his duties, though he remained on the property for several months under strict supervision. The master spent weeks dictating statements to neighbors, trying to reconstruct the events without revealing the extent of the household's collapse, the fear among the enslaved, or the nuances of Elise's involvement. Letters and depositions from the workers were collected, often under duress, and stored in a ledger whose pages are now partially illegible. Many testimonies were contradictory. Some attempted to protect Elise, others to condemn her. The family preserved only those documents that exonerated themselves or emphasized the chaotic and tragic nature of the events, while hints of broader complicity, of negligence, cruelty, or systemic oppression were quietly ignored. Yet the weight of the moral landscape persisted. Workers whispered to one another at night, recounting the events with details added, omitted, or reinterpreted with each retelling. Elise became a spectral presence in their collective memory, a figure simultaneously feared, admired, and mourned. Some called her the quiet hand of justice. Others whispered that she had embraced something monstrous, a reflection of the violence inherent in the world that had shaped her. Children grew up hearing fragments of her story, imagining her lurking behind trees, passing silently through the sugarcane, or watching from the shadows of the main house. For the surviving family members, every mundane decision became a reminder of vulnerability. Meals were prepared with meticulous care. Keys were counted and recounted. Stairs were scrubbed twice daily. Even the placement of furniture was reconsidered to prevent accidents, or to maintain the illusion of order. Their paranoia, already intense in the immediate aftermath, hardened into ritualized caution. Yet despite the measures, there remained a pervasive unease. The knowledge that the line between vengeance and justice had blurred, that fear could no longer be mitigated, and that history might remember events in a way that erased the uncomfortable truths about power, oppression, and the human capacity for cruelty. From the perspective of historians examining the plantation decades later, Elisa's actions form a puzzle of morality and consequence. Was she avenging years of systemic cruelty? Was she protecting herself and the enslaved community? Or had the prolonged exposure to violence and suppression driven her into a space where moral distinctions no longer applied? Letters, depositions, and oral histories suggest all three simultaneously, creating a narrative that is as unsettling as it is unresolved. Her silence, both during the events and in the historical record, remains a deliberate and chilling presence. It demands interpretation but refuses resolution. Over time, Elisa's story evolved into legend. The name Elise Carter became synonymous with the invisible power of the oppressed, a figure who could reshape the moral universe with minimal action. In neighboring plantations, tales circulated of a woman who could appear and disappear at will, of quiet justice meted out to those who had inflicted cruelty upon others, of the house that became restless when her gaze fell upon it. These legends, though sometimes exaggerated, preserve the essence of what had occurred, the inescapable consequences of unchecked authority and the moral ambiguity of acts committed under systemic oppression. The plantation itself changed as well. The main house was partially rebuilt following fire damage caused during the chaotic confrontation. The family retained ownership, but the rhythm of daily life was permanently altered. No worker or visitor could enter the estate without sensing a residual tension, a quiet dread that seemed almost sentient. The surrounding fields and cane rows remained lush, but the land itself felt shadowed by the memory of what had transpired. Generations of workers would grow up hearing only fragments, whispers, and warnings. Watch the house. Watch her. The quiet ones can do more than you think. By the final week of documentation, all that remained tangible were the ledger entries, letters, and the scorched remnants of the house's main hall. Every witness agreed, in varying degrees, that the events had left a permanent scar, not only on the physical estate, but on the collective conscience of those who lived and labored there. And in that scar, one could read an uncomfortable truth. Systems of power create conditions in which vengeance and justice can no longer be distinguished, and that those who act within such systems, even in silence, cannot escape the moral consequences of their choices. In conclusion, the legacy of Elise Carter is one of moral ambiguity and haunting reflection. Historians, both contemporary and modern, have debated her actions for decades. Did she protect the enslaved community, or did she exact private vengeance that ultimately mirrored the cruelty she had endured? Did her silence represent control or detachment? And what responsibility does history bear in interpreting acts committed within the confines of systemic oppression? The record preserves neither clarity nor consensus, only fragments of testimony, pieces of letters, and lingering fear. YouTube-style investigative outro/reflection. The story of Elise Carter invites us to ask uncomfortable questions. How do we define justice when those who wield power do so through oppression? When does revenge become indistinguishable from evil? And who decides the boundary? How does memory and the act of recording history shape what is remembered and what is erased? Elisa's presence lingers long after the events themselves, a reminder that human action can create consequences far beyond immediate perception. Her story challenges us to reflect not only on the horrors of the past, but also on the systems that allow cruelty to persist, and on the difficult moral choices faced by those trapped within them. History does not always provide neat resolutions. Sometimes, the weight of silence, observation, and deliberate action is all we have to guide our understanding. In examining Elise Carter, we confront not only her choices but the enduring question of what it means to act rightly, or at all, when the world itself is unjust. And for us, watching centuries later, the final question remains: If faced with such a world, what would we do? Would we act as Elise did? Or would we remain silent, complicit, and forever haunted by what could have been?